Most people have no idea that one of the most effective tools the Marines used in the Pacific wasn't a rifle, grenade, or machine gun. It was a discarded soup can. A dented, empty can, and once you understand the logic behind it, you realize how this unlikely object shattered an entire Japanese battalion, reshaped sniper doctrine, and altered the battlefield in ways historians still tend to overlook. What happened on Bougainville wasn't luck, and it wasn't expert marksmanship. It was a psychological setup so simple and so ridiculous that the Japanese had no way to counter it. 112 soldiers died trying to understand a trick they couldn't unravel. By the end of this story, you'll see the real secret, not just how the tactic worked, but why it worked, and why this forgotten 5-day episode stands as one of the most devastating and misunderstood moments in the Pacific Campaign. A lethal battlefield tactic built from trash. A result few believed could ever happen. And a truth that was rarely spoken aloud. Most snipers are shaped by training. Thomas Callahan wasn't. He walked into sniper school already carrying something no Marine Corps lesson could instill, something the Japanese could never have anticipated. Callahan had grown up in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, where a missed shot wasn't merely an error, it was a hard reminder. If you misjudged the wind by an inch at 600 yards, you didn't injure an elk, you simply watched it vanish, knowing there would be no second opportunity. That harsh landscape shaped him long before the Marine Corps ever handed him a rifle. He didn't learn patience inside a classroom. No instructor had to teach him discipline. The mountains did, punishing anyone who rushed or acted impulsively. That mattered more than anyone realized, because the truth, the one almost everyone overlooks, is that Callahan's later soup can strategy wasn't born out of sudden improvisation. It grew out of pattern recognition. He had spent his entire life observing how living creatures behave when confronted with something unusual and knowing precisely when curiosity will override caution. People later claimed he invented a clever battlefield trick in the jungles of Bougainville. He didn't. He simply applied lessons that had been forming in him since childhood, lessons that had nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with survival. When Callahan enlisted after Pearl Harbor, he blended in with the thousands of other volunteers. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything remarkable. But the moment he stepped onto a rifle range, the instructors noticed something disconcerting. He didn't shoot like anyone else. Most Marines fired as soon as their sights centered on the target. Callahan waited. He studied the grass bending in one direction, the heat mirage drifting in another, the target shifting half an inch in the wind. He fired only when all three elements aligned. To the instructors, it appeared slow. To Callahan, it was the only shot worth taking. He ended up posting one of the highest scores of the cycle, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he refused to take a shot he didn't control completely. That mindset would become the foundation of everything he later achieved on Bougainville. 3 days after his performance on the range, he was reassigned to Scout Sniper School. And this is where the first major misconception about Callahan begins. People assume Sniper School turned him into a killer. It didn't. What the school actually did was give structure and vocabulary to instincts he already possessed. Gunnery Sergeant William Henderson, the instructor responsible for teaching sniper psychology, recognized this immediately. While other students treated the rifle as the core of their craft, Callahan treated it as the final step of a much longer process. Henderson began his course with a statement Callahan never forgot. The shot is the end of the operation, not the beginning. He followed it with the principle that separates ordinary snipers from true predators. A sniper who merely looks for targets is predictable. A sniper who creates targets is dangerous. And a sniper who influences the enemy's decisions before they ever sense his presence becomes something else entirely. Most students struggled with that idea. Callahan didn't. He embraced it instantly because it mirrored the way he had always hunted elk. You didn't chase the animal, you forced it to make the one choice that doomed it. During stalking drills, the contrast between Callahan and everyone else became obvious.
The others tried to get close. Callahan tried to disappear. In the final assessment, instructors scanned the field for hours with binoculars. They spotted nearly every student. Callahan never appeared. No flicker of grass, no glint of metal, no silhouette out of place. 9 hours later, he rose calmly and said, "I've been ready for about 15 minutes." After graduation, Henderson pulled him aside. He said, "You think like a hunter. Good. But you need to stop assuming the enemy behaves like an animal. Animals run from danger, soldiers investigate. Learn that difference, and you'll outthink anyone you face." That single correction, animals flee, soldiers investigate, became the hinge upon which the entire Bougainville operation ultimately turned. And here's the part almost no historian emphasizes. Callahan's true weapon wasn't accuracy. It was his ability to understand human curiosity. He didn't defeat the Japanese because he took better shots. He defeated them because he knew exactly when men can't resist looking at something, even when every instinct tells them not to. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't glamorous, but it was the seed of an idea that would soon destroy the Japanese battalion's ability to trust what they saw. A childhood spent reading the wind, a sniper psychology lesson about human behavior, a mind that recognized the fatal difference between instinct and discipline. All of it was about to converge on an island the Japanese believed was secure. Within days, their confidence and their intelligence network would collapse under the weight of a tactic so absurd no one thought it could possibly work. Callahan arrived on Bougainville expecting a brutal, grinding fight. What he didn't expect was the moment that would define his entire role in the campaign. For a week, he operated like any other Marine, holding defensive lines, patrolling the jungle, trying to adapt to terrain where every shadow looked like a rifle barrel. Japanese snipers seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They almost never fired from the same position twice. They owned that jungle.
The Japanese dominated the treetops, but the moment that changed Callahan's life wasn't a shot he fired. It was the one that killed the man standing beside him. On November 8, 1943, he and his spotter, Corporal James Rivera, were studying a patch of brush that looked slightly suspicious, nothing unusual, nothing blatantly dangerous. They'd raised their binoculars at scenes like this thousands of times. Rivera lifted his for just 3 seconds. That was all it took. A single, perfectly placed round, clean, precise, and silent until the instant it wasn't, sliced through the air from a hidden firing point nearly 600 yards away. Rivera collapsed immediately. No struggle, no final words, just the dull thump of a body dropping into the mud. Callahan didn't move. Not because he was fearless, but because he understood instantly what had just happened. A sniper of that caliber does not fire twice. A sniper that skilled doesn't risk exposing himself with follow-up shots. Rivera hadn't died because of luck. He'd been killed by someone Callahan recognized immediately. Another predator, a man who understood patterns as deeply as he did. So Callahan stayed perfectly still for half an hour, barely breathing, letting the jungle return to its natural rhythm around him. He didn't scan wildly, didn't panic, didn't call for artillery. He did something far more dangerous. He thought. He replayed Rivera's movement in his mind, the angle of the binoculars, the trajectory of the bullet, the position the Japanese sniper must have chosen to see them without being seen. Bit by bit, the entire geometry took shape. He knew the type he was up against, a disciplined, patient, meticulous marksman who would never fall for standard counter-sniper tactics. Callahan retrieved Rivera's body himself, carrying him through the mud before heading straight to his commanding officer. He didn't demand reinforcements or retaliatory fire missions. He asked for something officers rarely heard from enlisted men: permission to think beyond doctrine. Callahan wasn't emotional as he made the request. He was focused. "Sir, we can't outshoot him. We have to outthink him.
and that means doing something he's not trained to recognize. Morrison stared at him. What exactly does that mean? Callahan didn't answer. Not yet. The idea wasn't complete. He only knew one thing with certainty. If he used the tactics the Japanese expected, he would end up dead. Rivera had been killed by someone who anticipated reactions, not by someone prone to errors. If Callahan wanted to defeat that kind of opponent, he needed something neither army had ever put into their manuals, something that didn't even resemble a tactic. That night, sitting alone in a shallow foxhole, he searched for it. He wasn't looking for a weapon. He was searching for a vulnerability, a blind spot in Japanese training, a human instinct strong enough to overpower discipline. He thought about predators and prey. He remembered Henderson's warning, animals flee, soldiers investigate. Then he considered all the times he'd watched elk freeze at strange sounds and the times he'd seen hunters make the fatal mistake of standing up to look. Why do people investigate what they should ignore? Why do soldiers expose themselves to the unknown? The answer arrived in a way he never expected. While eating his evening ration, a can of chicken noodle soup, he placed the empty tin beside him. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, the last rays hit the rim and threw a sharp beam of reflected light across the jungle floor. Callahan froze. A glint, a tiny flash, a pinpoint of mirrored sunlight, a signal that wasn't a signal at all. Something so ordinary, so mundane, that no training manual on Earth had ever prepared soldiers to interpret it correctly. He rotated the can slightly. The beam shifted left. Another slight turn, it swept to the right. Not a weapon, not a tool, not even gear. Just garbage, but garbage that could do something no rifle ever could. It could provoke human curiosity without revealing anything about the shooter. In that instant, the idea took root. Not the full trick yet, but the underlying principle. The Japanese sniper who killed Rivera was disciplined, but even the most disciplined soldier is compelled to investigate the unexplained. Curiosity isn't a flaw. It's unavoidable. Callahan didn't need better precision. He needed to manufacture the exact moment when a sniper forgets caution and leans out to look. That night, the soup can sat beside him in the dirt as he finally understood the paradox that would define the next 5 days. If he couldn't make the enemy fear him, he would make them curious. Curious enough to die. The next morning, Callahan didn't head toward a firing line. He headed for the trash heap. While the battalion prepared for another day of navigating the jungle against an unseen enemy, Callahan quietly collected everything the others overlooked. Empty ration cans, bits of wire, broken stakes, the kind of debris men casually kicked aside. To most Marines, it looked absurd. To Callahan, it was leverage. He selected 5 soup cans whose surfaces were still reflective enough to catch sunlight, not because they were special, but because they were consistent and predictable. And he understood something vital. If you want to manipulate human behavior, the trigger must act the same way every time.
He wasn't assembling weapons. He was creating triggers, deliberate stimuli designed to provoke reactions. Before sunrise on November 9, he moved about 300 yards behind friendly lines to a small clearing overlooking areas where Japanese troops frequently passed. Not close enough to be in danger, but close enough to study their routines. He set the cans upright on thin stakes, angled slightly upward. The placement wasn't random, it was calculated. His goal wasn't for the cans to send an obvious signal. He needed them to almost signal, because the objective wasn't communication, it was uncertainty. He rigged simple strings that allowed him to tilt the cans by just a few degrees. Not enough to appear manipulated, but enough to alter the direction of the reflected beam. The idea was brutally straightforward.
One flash looks accidental. A second flash feels like coincidence. A third flash from a different point suggests intention. And soldiers cannot overlook intention, especially those trained to observe. At 6:15, sunlight pierced the canopy. The first can produced a thin, sharp glint that lasted barely 3 seconds. Then nothing. Half a minute later, another can flashed, then another. No rhythm, no obvious sequence, just enough continuity to hint that someone might be signaling. Callahan remained prone 300 yards to the south, far from the cans. He wasn't watching the reflections, he was watching the Japanese. 20 minutes went by with no response, exactly as he expected. Curiosity takes time to override discipline. Then the moment arrived. A figure eased slowly out of the tree line. His posture told the whole story. He wasn't emerging to fight, he was emerging to understand. He raised binoculars. That was the only cue Callahan needed. One steady breath, one controlled squeeze of the trigger, and the soldier dropped backward into the brush. The cans kept flashing harmlessly into the empty jungle, indifferent to the death they'd just helped cause. The Japanese answer came instantly and predictably. Mortars pounded the clearing where the cans were positioned, shell after shell, accurate and furious. But Callahan had already moved. He didn't care about the explosions, he cared about what the mortar fire revealed. Mortars aren't used out of anger. They are used when the enemy believes the flashes represent a genuine threat. With a single test shot, Callahan had accomplished 3 objectives. He confirmed Japanese doctrine. They investigate disturbances, then suppress them with overwhelming force. He learned their reaction time. It took roughly 20 minutes for curiosity to exceed caution. And he proved the core paradox of his concept. Something as absurd as a soup can could influence enemy decision-making. That evening, he refined the system. He punched tiny holes in some cans to produce softer, diffused flashes. He smeared mud on others to dull their shine. He experimented with angles that would create glints only during certain minutes of the morning. He wasn't improvising anymore. He was constructing a psychological device. When he presented his findings to battalion leadership that night, he expected disbelief. Instead, Lieutenant Luton and Colonel O'Brien asked him a single question. "How many men do you think this could eliminate if the enemy fails to adapt?" Callahan didn't embellish. 20 to 30 in a week, he answered. More if they respond the way trained observers usually respond. O'Brien didn't hesitate. Then you have 5 days. You'll get a security team and full freedom of movement. Your mission is straightforward. Break their ability to see the battlefield. That order meant more than anyone realized. It wasn't about killing snipers. It wasn't about thinning enemy ranks. It was something far more dangerous. Dismantling their perception. Because if an army can't trust what it sees, it can't function. And when it can't function, it doesn't lose by force. It loses to paralysis. Those 5 discarded soup cans, objects Marines normally kicked aside without noticing, had just become the foundation of an operation that would eliminate over 100 enemy soldiers in under a week and collapse an intelligence network the Japanese had spent months constructing. The tactic wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It wasn't even about superior shooting. It was the exploitation of a human reflex. When something strange happens, we look. And for the next 5 days, that instinct would be lethal. The operation began the next morning, November 10th. From the very first hour, one thing became obvious. The Japanese weren't being hunted by a sniper. They were being steered by a mechanism. Callahan didn't shoot because targets appeared. He shot because he created the conditions for targets to appear. He chose an area where Japanese movement followed predictable routes, not because they were sloppy, but because every army, no matter how disciplined, repeats behaviors under pressure. Then he set 6 soup cans in a broad arc, each angled so it would catch and reflect sunlight at slightly different moments.
As the sun rose, the cans didn't produce random glints. They flashed with just enough structure to appear deliberate. One long burst of light, a shorter one, then stillness. To someone untrained, it meant nothing. But to a trained observer, it resembled visual signaling, which was exactly what Callahan intended. Eventually, 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from a camouflaged bunker, pointing toward the flashing cans. One of them lifted binoculars. Their attention was fixed entirely on the apparent source of the signals. Callahan wasn't anywhere near that spot. He was positioned 90 degrees off to the flank, a direction no one would reasonably expect a threat to come from. 2 shots rang out. 2 bodies dropped. By sunset, Callahan had 9 confirmed kills, all carefully orchestrated. None were found by chance. The cans didn't help him locate the enemy. They manipulated enemy behavior until revealing themselves became unavoidable. Japanese doctrine had a blind spot. It relied heavily on observation. Callahan turned that reliance into a vulnerability. If the first day proved the method effective, the second day revealed something else. Callahan was no longer fighting generic infantry. He was hunting the man who killed Rivera. A certain tree nearly 700 yards away had gained a grim reputation. Marines had reported fire coming from that direction, but nobody had ever spotted the sniper. No muzzle flash, no detectable sound, no repeatable habits. A consummate professional. Callahan knew that such a sniper wouldn't chase random glints of light. His discipline was too refined. So Callahan didn't target the sniper directly. He targeted what the sniper valued. He constructed a fake forward command post. Marines walking around with maps, radios, and equipment in carefully choreographed movements. Nearby, the cans flashed in patterns mimicking tactical signals. To the Japanese sniper, this looked invaluable, an exposed command node broadcasting information. He would have to investigate. Callahan didn't position himself anywhere close to the decoy. Instead, he took up an angle to the north, aimed precisely at the tree suspected of housing the sniper. For an hour and a half, nothing stirred. Then the slightest shift in the foliage, too subtle for wind, too deliberate to be coincidence. A movement made by a man preparing to shoot. Callahan calculated the range at roughly 700 yards, an 8-mile-an-hour crosswind, 30 inches of elevation compensation, and about 2 feet of wind hold. At 11:27, the sniper eased his rifle barrel into a small opening. Callahan fired a single round. 2 seconds later, the body tumbled through the branches, the end of a master hunter who never imagined he'd be hunted with reflected light. This wasn't a duel of marksmanship. It was a duel of decision cycles, and Callahan had forced the enemy sniper into a predictable one. By the afternoon of November 11th, a strange shift became apparent. Japanese troops no longer reacted instantly to flashes. Fear was finally competing with curiosity. On the surface, that seemed like an improvement for them. In reality, it led to something worse. Fear changes behavior, and changed behavior becomes predictable. Now Callahan didn't need to guess how they would respond. He knew. They would hesitate, pull their sentries back, cluster under cover, and push information flow upward to officers. So Callahan escalated. He introduced multiple sets of cans, spaced farther apart. They didn't blink at random anymore. They blinked in sequences resembling patrol coordination signals, artillery adjustments, and defensive repositioning messages. The Japanese no longer knew whether the flashes were real communications or traps, and uncertainty is often deadlier than fear itself. 16 more soldiers died on the 3rd day, not because they acted foolishly, but because commanders desperately needed information, and obtaining information required exposure. The paradox deepened. As the more rigid and disciplined the Japanese became, the easier they were to manipulate.
November 13th turned into Callahan's most successful day. 27 confirmed kills. It wasn't raw lethality, it was systemic collapse. His deception network had reached a tipping point. So many cans, so many angles, so many overlapping flashes that the Japanese could no longer distinguish genuine threats from illusions. When defensive officers spotted multiple flash patterns at once, they assumed a major assault was imminent. They repositioned troops across exposed terrain, checked their flanks, attempted to coordinate countermeasures. Every one of these movements revealed them. Any officer who stepped into the open to verify true placement became a silhouette framed perfectly in Callahan's scope. Captured diaries later revealed the psychological toll. Lights appear from nowhere. Men go to check and do not return. Officers forbid investigation, but orders require observation. I no longer trust my eyes. Once an army stops trusting its own senses, it abandons the battlefield long before it physically retreats. Callahan didn't destroy Japanese manpower on the fourth day. He destroyed their confidence. On November 15th, heavy clouds rolled in. With no sunlight, there could be no reflections. The soup can system should have become useless. Instead, Callahan revealed the most overlooked part of his ingenuity. He hadn't built a weapon around light. He had built a weapon around compulsion. If glids could spark curiosity, so could sound. He hung empty ammunition cans from branches, filled them with small stones, and tied strings to shake them from a distance. Soft rattles, brief taps, subtle clatters suggesting movement or equipment being handled. By midday, the Japanese were trapped in the same behavioral loop. Patrols creeping out, observers revealing themselves, officers desperately trying to restore understanding, and Callahan positioned at angles nobody would ever suspect. 9 additional kills followed. The final shot occurred at 3:45 p.m., a Japanese officer consulting a map during a moment of chaos. One bullet, one collapse, one more break in their chain of command. When Callahan withdrew at 1600 hours, his 5 allotted days had ended.
That level of psychological strain doesn't vanish when you leave the firing line. It lingers. The medical officers described his condition with the polite term combat exhaustion. Not the dramatic kind involving shouting or shaking, the quiet kind, where silence weighs more heavily than gunfire. Callahan didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel proud. He simply understood something most outsiders never grasp. Every effective idea in war carries a human price, even for the person who invents it. While recuperating in the rear, he spent 2 weeks doing something he hadn't done in days: slowing down. He wasn't computing wind drift, predicting reactions, or constructing psychological traps, but his mind still wouldn't stop replaying everything. The flashes, the moments before each shot, each decision he made. He wasn't questioning the mission itself. He was wrestling with the realization that he had turned a basic human instinct, curiosity, into a weapon, and watched it kill more than 100 men who never understood what they were walking into. Decades later, in a quiet interview, he summarized the experience simply. "I wasn't proud of killing them. I was proud we survived. Sometimes that's the only victory you get." Callahan never confused necessity with glory. That clarity, dangerous on the battlefield, invaluable in the classroom, shaped the rest of his life. By January 1944, the Marine Corps made a decisive choice. Callahan would not return to frontline sniper duty. He had proven everything a sniper could possibly prove. Now the Corps wanted something else from him: his thinking. He was reassigned to Camp Pendleton as an instructor, not as a reward, but because they needed the next generation to understand what he had discovered, that the rifle is only one tool, and the real battlefield is psychological. Callahan accepted without complaint. He understood what the Corps was beginning to recognize. He wasn't a more lethal shooter than other snipers. He was a better problem solver. When Callahan entered a sniper classroom for the first time in 1944, he did something almost unheard of in 1944.
He erased the firing diagram on the board. Then he wrote a single sentence, his own adaptation of Henderson's doctrine. The enemy doesn't fear your rifle. He fears not knowing what you are. The students expected lectures about wind calls, shooting stances, camouflage. He covered those, but he didn't start with them. He started with questions. What does the enemy need to see? What can he not afford to overlook? What behavior can you trigger without exposing yourself? What decision do you want him to make? Most recruits had never encountered sniper work framed this way. To them, sniping was shooting. To Callahan, shooting was a byproduct, not the goal. He explained that the Bougainville operation had never been about cans or sunlight or clever improvisation. It had been about reshaping the enemy's interpretation of the battlefield. If the enemy sees the battlefield incorrectly, he defeats himself. Callahan wanted his students to absorb the principle that defined his 5 days on Bougainville. A sniper doesn't win by remaining unseen. He wins by making the enemy see the wrong thing. Over the next 2 years, Callahan trained more than 400 snipers. His influence spread quietly throughout the Marine Corps. Teams began experimenting with dummy signals. Deception firing positions became standard. Intelligence units incorporated false signature training. Counter-sniper doctrine shifted from find the shooter to control the shooter's decision-making. Callahan didn't preach heroism. He didn't talk about tallies. He talked about thinking. And that's where his real legacy began. Not in the jungles of Bougainville, but in chalk dust and quiet training ranges. Students remembered him for one phrase he repeated constantly. Creativity keeps you alive. Convention gets you killed. He meant it literally. He had lived it, and his students carried that lesson into battles he would never witness. Callahan survived the war physically untouched, but deeply shaped by what he had done. Back home in Montana, he returned to teaching high school science, coaching, and running problem-solving workshops. His students never suspected that their calm, patient teacher had once engineered the most effective sniper deception operation of the Pacific Campaign. He didn't talk about kills. He talked about ideas. He never glorified the soup can tactic. He talked about the principle behind it.
You don't defeat a strong enemy by overpowering him. You defeat him by making him think incorrectly. In civilian life, he taught the same lesson the battlefield taught him. The mind is always the decisive terrain. History tends to celebrate spectacle, offensives, tanks, bombardments, iconic photographs. Quiet ideas rarely make the headlines. That's why most people today don't know the truth about Bougainville, that a single Marine sergeant crippled an entire Japanese battalion's intelligence structure using trash, psychology, and unconventional thinking. But within military doctrine, the story never vanished. It evolved. Callahan's report was copied, circulated, analyzed, and ultimately absorbed into what modern militaries now call deception operations and false signature warfare. The concept that controlling the enemy's perception is more decisive than controlling physical ground. If the enemy sees incorrectly, the enemy fights incorrectly. Every modern tactic involving radar spoofing, dummy transmissions, distraction techniques, or information warfare owes something to the same principle Callahan uncovered with a soup can. Force the enemy to respond to something unreal. Then exploit the response. Simple, obvious, lethal, and in 1943, revolutionary. The most striking proof of his legacy didn't even come from the United States. It came from the Japanese. Captured manuals from 1944 showed new doctrine notes. Do not investigate light anomalies. Avoid exposure when verifying signals. Assume unknown stimuli are enemy deception. These instructions did not exist before Bougainville. They existed because of Bougainville.
You know an idea has changed warfare when the enemy revises its training to defend against it. Callahan didn't just disrupt a battalion, he forced a foreign army to rewrite its doctrine. For decades, whenever the story surfaced, people focused on the numbers: 112 kills, 5 days, soup cans, in improvisation, making Callahan appear like a gifted marksman with a quirky gimmick. But that version misses the real point. The true significance wasn't the kill count. The significance of Callahan's story wasn't just in the kills, it was in the shift he represented. A transformation from merely shooting enemies to shaping the choices they made. From relying on stealth to relying on misdirection. From reacting to danger to deliberately manufacturing it. Callahan didn't defeat the Japanese by outshooting them, he defeated them by outthinking them. The high casualty count didn't come from fast trigger work, but from the fact that he controlled the exact moments when his enemies exposed themselves. And that principle still underlies modern warfare today, from cyber deception to electronic jamming to psychological operations. The technology evolved, the idea did not. Near the end of his life, Callahan summed up his wartime experience with a single line: "I didn't beat them at their game, I changed the game." It's an easy sentence to admire, but a difficult one to truly grasp. Changing the game is never glamorous. It's not loud, it's not decorated, it's lonely, quiet, mentally draining work, the type that rarely earns medals, but often shapes outcomes. Callahan wasn't a symbol of American firepower. He represented something deeper in the American military mindset: decentralized initiative, trust in junior leaders, the freedom to think independently, and the belief that solutions can come from anywhere, even from a battered soup can. That spirit, not the cans and not the kill count, is what made his operation meaningful. Anyone who reaches the end of this story learns something most people never do. The Pacific War wasn't driven solely by machines or manpower. It was also shaped by individuals who refused to accept the boundaries of the battlefield. Callahan's trick didn't alter the overall map of the war, but it changed everything in a crucial sector at a crucial moment. And the doctrinal ripple effects stretched far beyond Bougainville. That's the real truth hidden behind the almost comical image of a Marine holding a soup can. Wars aren't won by the strongest force. They're won by the force that thinks differently first. And on Bougainville, across 5 remarkable days, one young sergeant proved exactly that. Not through raw firepower or cutting-edge equipment, but through imagination, the only weapon that cannot be countered.
If you visit the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia today, you'll find Callahan's Springfield rifle resting quietly behind glass. Beside it sit 3 dented, rusted soup cans. Most visitors walk past without slowing down. They have no idea that these scraps of metal once accomplished what artillery and air power could not. They blinded a Japanese battalion. The cans aren't displayed because they're odd relics from an unusual story. They're displayed because they symbolize a truth about war that people often overlook. Battles are shaped far more by thought than by hardware. Sniper students still study Callahan's case today, not to replicate the light reflection trick, but to learn how he saw the battlefield. He viewed it not as a landscape with targets, but as a network of human minds, all struggling to interpret what they perceived. Influence that interpretation, and you gain an advantage no rifle can equal. What most people don't know, and what even fewer appreciate, is that Callahan never considered himself brilliant. In every interview, every document, every moment reflecting on Bougainville, he said the same thing: "I just looked at the problem differently." To him, those 5 days weren't miraculous. They were logical. They came from refusing to accept that the only way to beat a master sniper was to shoot better than him. Instead, Callahan rewrote the rules entirely. And that simplicity is exactly why his story matters. If victory depended on extraordinary talent or superior gear, it would be rare and impossible to repeat. But if victory comes from perspective, from asking the questions no one else thinks to ask, then any soldier in any era can learn from it. That is Callahan's true legacy. Not the number 112, not the 5 brutal days, not the intelligence report that struggled to describe what he accomplished. His legacy is the reminder that every system has a blind spot, and sometimes you don't need sophisticated optics to find it. Sometimes all you need is an empty soup can. After the war, Callahan returned to the quiet life of small-town Montana. He taught high school, coached students, mentored young thinkers, never hinting to them that he had once convinced an entire Japanese unit they were being hunted by supernatural flashes of light. When he passed away in 2003, the words Marine Sniper appeared only once in his obituary, but those who knew the history understood. The gentle teacher had once unraveled an enemy's confidence so thoroughly that they rewrote their doctrine because of him. And that's where the story truly ends, not in gunfire or awards, but in one simple truth. War evolves, but unconventional thinking never becomes obsolete. Technology changes, weapons advance, tactics adapt, but the fundamental principle Callahan uncovered remains as true as ever. The side that wins is the side that makes the enemy think incorrectly. His innovation didn't come from superior weapons or exceptional marksmanship. It came from imagination applied to a deadly problem. He showed that ingenuity doesn't depend on rank, budget, or regulation. It appears whenever someone refuses to accept that the world must be interpreted the way everyone else interprets it. And that is why 80 years later, those rusted soup cans still sit behind glass, not as memorials to destruction, but as tributes to creativity. Creativity that saved Marines, crippled an enemy, and reshaped doctrine. Because in every conflict, there is one kind of power no enemy can ever anticipate: the imagination of a person determined to survive.